Listen, we live in an age of instant information, so isn't it strange that things have been hidden away from us? Governments think we need to gain their trust, but it's the other way around. Just take a look. Nothing tells us more than raw data does, so it's important it's all available to us. Plus, put up for debate and looked at by the public's gaze, because there's a lot more.
Hello, and welcome to the Tech Dirt Podcast. I'm Mike Masnick. Once again, I wanted to thank all of you for listening, for sharing feedback, and for telling others to listen. We've been getting lots of great feedback, and certainly some critical feedback as well, and it's all good to us. We're always looking to improve and make the podcast better, so please keep the feedback coming. That idea of constantly trying to make something better is often seen as the mantra behind Silicon Valley. Robert Friedel wrote a wonderful book called A Culture of Improvement that talks about the history of technological innovation, but it's a story that most clearly applies to Silicon Valley itself. There's been a lot of talk lately about what makes Silicon Valley, and I've got my own theories, some of which we'll be discussing shortly. However, what's really incredible to me is how many people just focus on the superficial aspects of it. Over the last few years, I've ended up meeting with tons of people, often European politicians or European company officials, all trying to understand what makes Silicon Valley so they can go back home and build their own Silicon Valley. And they almost always focus on the wrong things. They talk about the good universities and the venture capital money and think that they just need to throw money at a local university and build a fund to invest in entrepreneurs, and they too can create their own Silicon Valley. And the truth is, it never works that way. And that's because they're always missing the real things that make Silicon Valley work. And that is the culture. It's the culture of information sharing and a free flow of information that creates the big innovations here. We can get into the details later, but as I've written about in the past on TechDirt, studies have shown that the fact that non-compete agreements are unenforceable is the single biggest factor in making Silicon Valley such a hotbed of innovation. And it's not just because of non-compete agreements, but what they actually created. And that is a culture where if you feel that you can make it better, you can easily go off and start your own thing or jump to another company that gives you a better chance. And with that movement of people, there's a much freer flow of information and perspectives. And it's that kind of information sharing that leads to a greater ability to tackle the big challenges. Unlike what many believe, the big innovation breakthroughs are often the result of many different people all working together to make incremental improvements, and often it helps to have new and different perspectives dropped in at different points, and that is what the information flow in Silicon Valley has enabled. So to talk about what makes Silicon Valley so special, we've got our regular crew of Dennis Yang and Hirsch Reddy. All of us came here at about the same time in the late 90s, and we've witnessed Silicon Valley through boom and bust cycles. And we're going to start with Dennis because you got here a year before I did, so I'll let you kick it off because you have one more year of Silicon Valley experience. So I'll let you jump in terms of what do you think really makes Silicon Valley have this kind of culture today?
So, I mean, I arrived here in 1997. This is, I guess, my 18th year in San Francisco, and
I beat you by a year, huh?
Oh, I should have started with Hirsch.
No, go ahead. I was here. I was an intern, though. I came here as an intern.
Oh, that doesn't count.
Yeah, exactly.
that doesn't.
And you left for a while, too.
Well, we'll come back to mine. Go ahead, Dennis.
So I guess my point is, after being here 18 years, I finally kind of feel like San Francisco Dennis is 18, come of age in San Francisco. I mean, it's an eternity here.
Yes.
To be here for 18 years. But I think that, one of the biggest things, I mean, I've been in, I guess, five different companies in those 18 years. One of which was in Austin. And actually, prior to me working at a company in Austin, I would always question why people would move here. And, it's so expensive here, and especially working in technology, and, we work in a connected world now, increasingly so. And I would always, when people were moving here from the East Coast or interesting research communities like Chapel Hill, or, I'm like, it's so expensive to live here. Why don't you just, stay where you are, form a community? Surely there's other people that work in technology there. And since we're all connected, like, is that really that important? And after working in Austin for a year, I really did realize that, the mass of the kismet of meeting people out here is really, like, it's incredible. And, and part of it is because everyone moves around so freely in terms of, it's not just that people are here physically. You can schedule meetings. Mm-hmm. People are willing to talk about what they're doing. There's a huge culture of, I think, cooperation as opposed to competition.
Yeah. Well, and I think, I think it's sort of this weird thing that from the outside people don't necessarily get, and this goes back, if you even look at, like, the early days when Silicon Valley became Silicon Valley, when it was silicon companies that were working on chips. There are a lot of stories of how people would get together and meet and share, even though they were working in competing companies, and they were discussing things. And you have things like the Homebrew Computer Club, right,
yep.
where people were trying to build the first computers, and it was a community aspect. And it's tough to sort of explain why that worked. What came out of that certainly led to tremendous competition. So it's not collusion, and it's not.
But I think that some of the nature of the work lends itself to needing cooperation, right?
Yeah.
So we have things like HTML and
mm-hmm.
like things that need to be standardized, and without the actual, like, working together, you can't create these platforms from which that these companies are built.
So my argument here is that what you need is that collaboration to build the sort of common language or common platform or common breakthrough, and then everyone rushes in to compete on top of that. And that's something that I think is missing in most other places. Like, you don't have that recognition that you want to create this level of innovation. And then, there's still tremendous competition above and beyond that. But people realize that the big breakthroughs create, it sounds cliche, but you create this larger pie, and then you can compete for the different slices of that pie.
Yeah, and I was basically kind of digging around in Bitcoin land last year,
mm-hmm.
And I wasn't here for the original Homebrew Computer Club, but I actually it felt like what I would have imagined.
Right.
There was like the guy with the big long beard in the corner. We were all discussing about this new technology which at the time was pretty revolutionary from a technology standpoint. Still trying to figure out what exactly I think it's going to be the super impactful application of that technology. But
that's another podcast for another time.
Another podcast.
Yeah.
But the culture of it and the excitement of meeting regularly, and there are tons and tons of meetups and meetings and clubs all around the Bay Area, and that was the one big difference between a smaller scene that like Austin that I saw in San Francisco, which was in Austin there was a meeting of the Austin Technology Club, right? And I forget what it was called, but it was everyone involved in programming, and I went to and it was a good group of 50 people or so, and with the amount of people that are working in and around technology here, the small, tiny, like kind of niche scenes have enough critical mass to have a meetup, right? So it's like
of their own.
Their own. So I think that back at that time when I was working in Austin, there was Ruby was pretty big, and I went to one Ruby meetup in Austin, and here in San Francisco there's a Ruby on Trails meetup, which is for Ruby enthusiasts that like hiking, and it's like So and it's like really like there's enough people that just for these tiny little factions.
I think Hirsch, I'll get to you in a second. I think that and part of that is that it, again, having all of these diverse opinions is not just the fact that you have this, this critical mass of all these people, but through the diverse opinions and the discussions and the fact that whether you like it or not, you're constantly running into people who are in the business and having discussions about it. And that's often where the big breakthroughs come through, because you're having these discussions and something clicks.
Right.
And so the new things get created, and you get those big innovations and the big breakthroughs. Yeah,
and inevitably, the people that you work with are, I've been here 18 years and probably seen and met with and worked with hundreds, if not maybe thousands of people at this point.
Yeah.
And who knows, where you might end up in in not even just 1 year, but 2 or, 18 years. So, and I think that's everyone is connected, and more so now than ever. And I think that culture of actually collaboration really does permeate through the Valley.
I'm going to give an alternative theory for this.
Go for it.
So I think that culture of collaboration is present in a lot of places. I don't think that it's only in Silicon Valley. I don't think that explains what Silicon Valley has become. I think that people feel like more of that is happening here because of the nature of the kinds of companies we have here. And it's not that sharing created those companies, but rather that sharing is magnified by the sale of companies. And what I mean by that specifically is Silicon Valley happens to, a lot of the employment is around lots of smaller startups or medium-sized companies. You go to a lot of other towns, there's only 1 or 2 large tech conglomerates, and anybody in programming works for that one or 2 companies.
That dominates. Right?
Yeah, and so people don't tend to move around a bunch of like little companies. They're just they usually shuffle between those 2 big companies, or maybe they're just working at that one company. Yeah. Right. And it changes the dynamic of the town. People really need to reach out to people in other companies in Silicon Valley because you're constantly moving between employers. It's very rare you'll meet somebody that worked for the same employer for like 10 years in Silicon Valley. Yeah. Almost everyone is jumping ship every 3 to 4 to 5 years, right? 5 years is considered a pretty long term at a company, I think, now in Silicon Valley. Most people work there shorter periods of time. And so you tend to have coworkers or ex-coworkers in different places. Mm-hmm. You reach out to them when you're going to go to another place. If people are having problems, their network of people that they look to are not just within the company, they're across companies. And I see that in the startup I'm at right now. People have engineering problems. They'll call up people they know. Mm-hmm. And they won't get some specific advice, but they'll just, in general terms, say like, hey, what have you used? What kind of tools in this area? So those kinds of things happen because the companies are smaller. And if you want to look at a place that has completely different kinds of laws and a completely different kind of system, but you see similar things, you just go to China and look at what they do around hardware manufacturing there. You'll see a lot of cross-pollination between hardware companies, contract manufacturers, around hardware processes and all that. You'll see the same kind of collaboration, and you'll see the same kinds of results of that. Not just the cross-pollination of workers, but things like people collaborating together in informal ways to create platforms.
And creating some really amazing innovations.
Stuff, right?
Yeah.
So I don't think that is unique to Silicon Valley, nor that the culture specifically caused it. I think what has really happened in Silicon Valley is an accident of history. That's the way I think of it. I think what happened was, originally you had the real Silicon Valley, the hardware companies. Mm-hmm. And when the hardware companies, when the Fairchild Semiconductors spawned through the Trader Estate, the Intel, and then a bunch of other little companies, those hardware companies, since they were here, they spawned certain software companies. And in that first generation, I think, of Silicon Valley, if you came here, you wouldn't have seen these things that Dennis was talking about, like the sharing and stuff like that, because those were relatively few large siloed companies. It would have probably felt a lot like being in Detroit or in the Midwestern industrial industries, right? But then I think what happened is those hardware companies spawned software companies, right? Like, the first generation Microsoft and Oracle and stuff like that, still large monolithic companies. But then those smaller service software companies came about. And now we have the next generation of that, not just Web 1.0, but the 2.0, the AWS spawned companies, where the cost of starting companies is so low. The capital structure to spawn those little companies is based here. And so you basically have this proliferation of small companies. Mm-hmm. And those small companies, by their very nature, depend upon each other for various kinds of services, whether it's on-demand services or to find employees. You have to network. Part of being a successful CEO in Silicon Valley is you have to be able to network to not only get your capitals, but also perhaps to get your first customers and all those things.
Yeah, and your employees, right? So.
And your employees. And so that is what has created that culture. Now, when we were talking about, when did you come to Silicon Valley? I came to Silicon Valley first in 1996, and I started working full-time in 1997. And then in 98 or so, I went to Mesa in Arizona and worked in a video game company there. And it was definitely a lot more insular than Silicon Valley. I think, I didn't really meet technical people outside of the game company, except for a couple of people who worked at Intel, right? Which was a big employer, a tech employer there. And there was a few Motorola people that I met. And then I moved from there to go to Portland, and it was the same kind of thing where I was working at Intel at that time there. And I mostly met Intel people. and I knew there was a few Microsoft people in town, but it wasn't like when I was working in Silicon Valley in '97, where you met tons of people from different companies. And then when I finally came back to Silicon Valley in about '99 or 2000 timeframe, it was back to being in sort of the heart of things with lots of really small companies. And you, just by its nature, you would hang out with tons of different people in different companies. Now, what was different about sort of the Arizona and Portland experience? People had the same culture. We were all Americans, right? We come from the same kind of universities and stuff like that, and we collaborate in the same ways. And I think the difference was, to some extent, really, in Silicon Valley, you are jammed up close to other companies. You might be working in a building, there'd be like 3 other tech companies in that building. You know what I mean? Or let's say you just walk down the street to get a sandwich. 2 of the guys you meet there, just randomly getting sandwiches, they won't be like construction workers. There'll be other software people, right?
Yeah.
That wasn't the case in Arizona, and that wasn't the case.
Right. I mean, that's part of the kismet, I think, that really does happen here. It's the unplanned, it's getting drinks on a Monday night with somebody, and then they bring one of their friends, and they just happen to be the expert in the exact problem that you've been trying to solve for the past 2 weeks.
But I suspect that same kind of collaboration happens around, let's say, clothing design in, say, Milan, or fashion in New York, or do you know what I mean? So I think maybe it doesn't come across as much in those other industries, because those industries, maybe there's more of an advantage to not being so open to stuff. Like if you're in like maybe car design or something like that, right? Like you might not have the opportunity to collaborate like that, because ultimately you're working for these very vertically integrated companies that make a specific product. So I think it's the product that spawns what we view as and in this case, the product is software that spawns the kind of external manifestation, and not the other way around.
Yeah, I mean, I think
right, but I think like why here? Why?
That's the historical accident part of it. I think it's because the hardware precursors were here,
right?
And if you believe me, that when the hardware precursors started here, Fairchild Semiconductor probably came here for no better reason than the land was cheap, right? And the weather was good. I don't know why. I don't really know the history.
Well, I mean, Fairchild. I mean, the story there is. I mean, you could trace it back to William Shockley and Shockley Semiconductor, and it was the Traitorous Eight, which you mentioned before. They left Shockley to found Fairchild.
Oh, Fairchild! I thought it was Intel. Founded. I got it
right. So they left again.
Yeah.
Or 2 of them left again.
To make Intel.
Two of the Traitorous Eight were 2/3 of the founders of Intel.
So I got the history wrong.
Yeah, but it's close enough. And so and Shockley was here because of connections to Stanford University. So some of that does go back to Stanford University. And you could say that back then, and there were elements. Certainly, Stanford did things in the 1940s time frame to really make itself friendly to entrepreneurial efforts, and worked in terms of helping HP set up shop in the early years was a big thing that
I forgot about HP, right?
Stanford was super helpful with. And so, some of it certainly does go back to Stanford. And then also, if you do look at the people who left, well, I mean, if you look at the Traitorous Eight, the 8 guys who left Shockley and went to Fairchild, and then where most of them went, and the Fair Children, which includes Intel and AMD and NetSemi, and
I didn't know AMD was from the same.
Yeah, AMD is from the same origins, and then but also Kleiner Perkins and Sequoia Capital and the beginnings of the venture capital. And so to some extent there is this element too that they then did give back in terms of they then funded the next generation. And so I think there is some element to that, but I would argue too that a lot of that goes back to the idea that of that collaboration and the fact that it wasn't that they would just take the money out of what they had
but
done
it's a founder's effect. I think once you get the ball moving, people tend to go to the biggest place, and then that only magnifies the effect. There's also like little synergistic little communities around Raleigh, North Carolina, Boston, Harvard, that area. There's probably Austin is probably a little bit too, right?
And New York has a great.
New York is great, but even still, last year I think I don't remember the exact percentage, but it was I think almost half the venture funding in 2014 went to kind of
goes
Silicon
to California.
Valley. To California.
But that's the thing, right? Like once everybody's established in a place, there's so much synergy. Why would you go anywhere else? But it really it doesn't explain why that place started. It's just that, for whatever, I'm trying to think of the physical analogy, but like, when you're like a liquid's flowing on a surface and there's a small imperfection in a place that creates an eddy, and then more stuff gets jammed
and
up
there's certainly part of that. And, but again, going back to the studies that I sort of mentioned in the opening, there have been studies that sort of go to that point to the non-compete issue, right? And the fact that it made it easier to go to another company to have that sort of situation. And
does Massachusetts do that, and New York and the state of Washington?
So
are those enforceable? Because I know in Austin, I was asked to sign a non-compete,
right?
And I was like, what is this?
Massachusetts, they're enforceable.
Okay.
A few other states are enforceable, but the other.
So if they were to
change it, it would be interesting to see.
Yeah.
But the one example of that, but in the other direction, is actually Detroit,
right?
Where Michigan, for basically the same period, starting in whatever the late 1800s, Michigan had non-competes as not enforceable,
right?
And in the 1980s, they changed the law, and it wasn't on purpose, but part of the way they changed the law, they just rewrote it. Suddenly, non-competes became enforceable, and if you look at the timing of sort of the collapse of Detroit, it maps very, very closely to the timing of that legal
but that's
change.
Just a correlation.
It's a correlation,
sure,
and
but it's very close. Is what you're saying.
But it's very close, and people have studied, and what they saw was they looked at. I haven't looked at this study in a while, so I don't remember exactly how they figured this out. But they had looked at the career paths of what they had labeled star engineers. And again, I don't know how they figured this out, but they had some sort of methodology for determining star engineers. And before this legal change, star engineers would bounce around. They would bounce around between certainly the big three automakers, but also some of the other supplying startups in the Detroit area. After the legal change, they basically stopped. And they would stick with wherever they were working. And so, the enforceability of non-competes became a big differentiator in terms of the ability to go to another startup or to go to another company. And with that, I think a lot of the information sharing stopped. And so you do have this counterexample where you had, an industry that was super successful for many years that began to fade.
But, the other thing you have to think about there, though, is think about this culturally. When you have very large aggregated organizations, there's a company culture. They breed a certain kind of corporate man,
sure.
Right? And those people are not, the corporate man is not ideally suited culturally, or trained to be an entrepreneur. You need all this, you think about things a different way, you require all this support. And it's difficult for such a person to go out and start the new, once his old company starts crumbling, it's really hard for him to leave and start the new electric car company. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but I mean, again, if you look at Silicon Valley, right? I mean, there is, there's a big need for managers and company people, right? But here in Silicon Valley, those people are still much more likely to jump to startups or jump to a new job.
I mean, I really don't think a 10-year company man from most of these places are the ones that are starting the startups. It's a different population.
No, and I'm not saying they're necessarily starting the new startups. And in some cases there are certainly counterexamples.
Sure.
But they're going to different companies. They don't necessarily stay at the company, and they'll go and they'll be a company person at another company.
Yeah, but I think that rewards. Basically, if you're in a company for a few years and you feel like you can do a bigger job, you can either wait around for the promotion at your own company, or here, I think it's perfectly legitimate to leave your company and for a better job. And I think that type of kind of culture has accelerated probably career growth within a company, as well as, it's, if you can't find it within, you can move to another company. And I think that's very healthy, right? Like it doesn't, it's not stagnant. And
so. Yeah. Let me raise one other issue, and this is something that I've been sort of thinking on in the last month or so. And I had met with, again, there was some European government officials basically trying to figure out again, sort of, how do we go back to Europe and build a Silicon Valley in Europe? And
I mean, it sounds like, is it just non-enforceable non-competes and
but it's
property
not
rights, or
I mean,
and then what?
No, I mean, you have these sort of bigger discussions around it. But one of the interesting things that they actually, that one of these guys said back to me after we were talking about these things, and they had been making the tour of Silicon Valley, And it was sort of a realization that I think this guy had after meeting with a few different companies. And he said, everywhere, when they talk about building in Silicon Valley, they talk about building a tech industry. And everything is focused on tech. And so you think about tech policy, and they think about things like patent law, because that's what everyone thinks tech policy is about. Yeah. But he said, what I'm realizing is that what everyone in Silicon Valley thinks about is not technology, because everyone here is focused on solutions. Right. So they look at problems and they look for solutions. They don't look for technology. And people here, you're not building, there is some technology behind it, but nobody is here thinking about, I want to build technology. You're thinking about, how do I solve this problem or solve a problem? Yep. And so there's something really interesting in that, and that I think when you think about things in that way, when you frame it as solution solving, it sounds kind of elitist or something. Maybe that's not the right word.
A little too hippie?
not even hippie, but like it's
too buzzwordy?
Yeah, maybe. But
I think maybe that's why some of the efforts to so-called start a Silicon Valley elsewhere is focused too much on the Silicon Valley part.
Yeah, and I think that's the more I was thinking about it, is like that's the mistake that so many people make, is they focus on how do you build a tech industry. So they think about patents, which we've discussed plenty of times is not the way to encourage it. And they think about we have to invest in,
let's build an office park. They do the cosmetic things.
Right, they do the cosmetic things, and they invest in PhDs and scientists, because they think
we need a university.
We're going to have these big breakthroughs in technology, but it's not the big breakthroughs that are the really interesting thing. It's the things that drive the real innovation are the small incremental things, the things that make things work, right? The actual solutions, the things that people actually adopt.
But that's why I think, Boston seems to have a lot of the same kind of solutions-oriented culture, right? The MIT Media Lab has always come up with weird novel. I think that was where the first coffee pot on the internet was.
But they do spawn lots of.
Yeah, and I think that's I think Boston is very close to Silicon Valley.
They just happen to move here when they actually get to
who
wants to live in freezing Boston? The weather helps a lot, by the way, guys.
The
weather helps a lot.
But there are lots of places with nice weather that don't have.
In the state of California, I might add. Why isn't Silicon Valley in San Diego or LA? Right?
I don't know.
So that proves that. There's some geographical stuff and some of that first founder effect stuff, right? Or else we would have a little bit of Silicon Beach or something.
I don't deny that. I mean, there are elements of that. But.
I mean, I want to get I like your the solution thing is actually one thing when I'm talking to an engineer that I'm looking to hire. What I love to ask is, what are your side projects? What have you fixed?
Yeah.
That tinkering mind, that curiosity. That. If I meet an engineer and they don't have anything that they've kind of fixed around their house with, call it technology, call it not whatever, but that's the kind of person that I find I'm meeting a lot here, right? And you can find them in other places, but there's a lot of tinkerers here that are constantly just fixing problems, and maybe they're using technology, but I think that's kind of really, really powerful when you live in around the Bay Area. So.
This whole 3D printer thing, you got to remember, it started out with people just wanting to make stuff, right? No one was thinking about having an industry or something, but it might start another whole other industry, right?
Or many industries.
Or many industries, right?
And destroy some other ones at the same time. So that's another podcast for another day. And but I think we're running out of time here. But do we want to have any sort of final thoughts? I mean, I and obviously I think that. There isn't one single answer, and there are a lot of factors, and I think probably all the different things that we've talked about play into it. But in terms of final thoughts, I mean, I wonder, and I don't even know if I have the answer to this question that I'm about to ask, but I'll throw it out to you guys while I think of an answer. What would you tell other people from other places that are trying to sort of build that kind of culture, or build their own kind of thing somewhere else rather than here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, obviously the things that we've been talking about in terms of the momentum of Silicon Valley, the access to capital, education, even the free sharing culture and non-competes. Mm-hmm. I think that, we are in, a state of the world right now such that access to ideas is freer than ever. So if you are in a small community, you're not necessarily that small. It's harder to get access. It's harder to get the kismet to meet people at the coffee shop and whatnot. But I think it's there. Just don't compare yourself to Silicon Valley. Is what I feel. You know, it's like, yes, things are good here, but what is it about being? You know, I'm from Cleveland, so like, what is it about Cleveland that is uniquely suited to Cleveland that you can actually, maybe there's an access to a smaller market that we're completely ignoring living out here in California, and focus on the types of solutions that you can provide. And, you know, maybe it's great that you're the biggest shop in the small town.
And you have access to a lake that burns.
Yeah, the river, but it's much cleaner now.
So what I would say is that, you know, with technology moving in the direction of having like really high fidelity remote teleconferencing and things like that, as well as all these different new online educational places like, you know, Khan Academy, Udacity, Coursera, those kinds of places, being able to surface students in different, or I wouldn't even say students, surface people in different places in the world who have certain kinds of talents. Those methods are only going to get better. LinkedIn's going to be another one.
Yeah.
I think that
Oculus is coming.
Oculus, exactly. There's going to be essentially, we should stop thinking about Silicon Valley as a specific place. It'll become like this distributed notion of there will be certain types of industries that are very Silicon Valley-ish in terms of evolving quickly, hiring people in distributed places, and being able to spawn lots of small, innovative companies. And I think, you know, 3D printing will be one. Software will continue to be another industry. And I think more and more we'll see consumer electronics companies that are very small and targeted and maybe perhaps even short-lived. Things like a Pebble. I'm not saying Pebble is short-lived, but you know what I mean. Like spawning very quickly, spawning from like Kickstarters and things like that. So I think we'll see we'll see people working remotely together in teams, and maybe we'll see even something more crazy like people forming ad hoc companies, right? Like tied together by like loose things like contracts, as opposed to like some kind of corporate entity, like open source projects delivering value in that way. We'll see. I think we'll see a lot of that. Anyways, that's
and I think that's interesting. That might be another discussion for another podcast. But I mean, from my standpoint, I think I would definitely focus on, you know, the very solutions oriented culture rather than thinking about it in terms of technology. And then the other aspect is really recognizing, encouraging, and enabling the sort of openness and sharing of information, and learning to get over the general fear that people have about, you know, the need to sort of hoard information, and the belief that, you know, the great breakthroughs and the great innovations come from, you know, one company or one individual working at a company and coming up with that big breakthrough. I think the more you recognize that sharing of information, the free flow of information, even among different companies, often leads to the big breakthroughs. And the more that you can do from a policy standpoint to encourage that kind of thing, I think tends to have results, and certainly has had results in this part of the world. So I think that's it for today. Hirsch and Dennis, thank you very much for another interesting discussion, and thanks to all of you for listening. We'll be back next week. Later.
The truth will set you free. The truth will set you free. The truth will set you free.